I put together this video last night featuring a collection of some of the most gruesome bear attacks covered on the channel thus far. This includes the brutal mauling of 2 people in British Columbia in what was an unprecedented black bear rampage, the fatal mauling of a couple in India by a rabid sloth bear, Hollywood's most infamous real-life grizzly bear attack, and much more. You're watching Volume 2 of the world's deadliest bear attacks. As Ray Kitchen, a 56-year-old trucker from Fort Nelson, BC, delivered his final load of explosives to seismic crews working on the Alaska Highway, he decided to take a break at Liard River Hot Springs Provincial Park with his 11-year-old daughter Jolene and her friend Sarah. The park is located in the Boreal Forest and is a popular tourist spot featuring campsites, breathtaking scenery, as well as a famous children's playground. It was August 14th of 1997. And Kitchen was looking forward to a day of relaxation where he could sit back and watch his girls swim. After having just spent mere minutes in the water, the peaceful ambience was suddenly shattered by ear-piercing screams coming from the Hanging Gardens, another one of the many famous attractions at the park. Kitchen sprang into action upon hearing this and ran along a slick boardwalk, climbing wooden stairs to the viewing platform, which is when he was met with a horrific scene. A massive black bear was mauling a young boy and a motionless woman, both covered in blood from deep wounds. What happens next would go down as one of the most tragic, yet heroic true tales in North American history. This is a true story of the Liard Springs tragedy of 1997. After a long and exhausting journey from Paris, Texas, Patty McConnell and her 2 children, Kelly and Kristen, were relieved to arrive at Liard River Park. Eager to unwind, they quickly changed into their swimsuits and made their way to the lower pool. The water was warm and inviting, and they enjoyed a relaxing soak before deciding to venture into the more secluded upper pool. However, Kristen would quickly grow restless, which is when she would dash back to the lower pool to play with some newfound friends. Concerned for her safety, McConnell and Kelly would follow Kristen. As they approached the Hanging Gardens, Kelly suggested a better vantage point, and so the pair climbed a flight of steps to a viewing platform. Momentarily lost in the beauty of the myriad of exotic plants that the park hosted, the pair are unaware of the rustling bushes beside the boardwalk. As McConnell descended the wet steps, her attention was quickly drawn to something else. She locked eyes with a big adult male black bear sitting in the shrubbery chewing on a dogwood branch. Stunned, McConnell whispered urgently to her son, "Kelly, bear." Kelly, however, thought she was joking and turned around only to come face to face with a towering black bear. Realizing the potential danger, he cautioned his mother not to make any sudden movements. Kelly then slowly begins moving closer to McConnell, which is when the bear suddenly snorted and lunged through the railing onto the boardwalk, prompting Kelly to yell in a panic, "Mom, run!" McConnell would then sprint back up the stairs to the viewing platform, but the bear was fast approaching. And just moments later, Kelly watched in horror as the bear grabbed his mother in between its mighty jaws. Despite his scrawny frame, Kelly then courageously attacked the bear and kicked it in the face, shouting at it to get off his mother in the process. The relentless ursine grunted and returned to McConnell, not paying any attention to Kelly, who cleverly took advantage of this by searching for a weapon. Fueled by rage and surging with adrenaline, Kelly then grabbed a sawed-off tree limb and began repeatedly swinging it at the bear's head, while simultaneously screaming for help at the top of his lungs. Just as he'd catch a glimpse of his mother's blood on the bear's teeth, a now further enraged Kelly would then manage to land a powerful strike directly on the bear's nose, causing it to growl and lash out at him with its powerful paws, leaving deep claw marks on his neck and shoulders. The bear then turned its full attention to Kelly, overpowering him with its weight and biting down on his waist, which is when it proceeded to swing him around in the air as if he were a toy. It was at this point that Kelly felt himself losing consciousness as the bear flung him onto the deck with force, leaving him in a ball beside his motionless mother. As a now severely injured Kelly desperately attempts to crawl towards Patty, the determined bear would attack again and tear at Kelly's flesh with its teeth, causing him to scream in pain as he simultaneously controlled his urge to vomit from the rancid stench of its breath. Kelly at this point knew that death was near, which is when he would close his eyes and wait for the inevitable. This is when aforementioned Ray Kitchen arrives at the scene. He would react to the situation quickly and picked up a fallen tree branch and proceeded to pound it against the railing, shouting, "Hey, get off!" When the bear ignored him, Kitchen would then grab a larger branch and shove it into the animal's stomach, hoping to push it away from Kelly. The bear would then divert its full attention towards Kitchen and charged at him, knocking him through the railing and into the bushes. Kitchen protected himself from the bear's claws by scrambling on his knees to a nearby tree and covering his head with his hands. He would then scream for help. Hearing the commotion, 71-year-old Frank Headingham rushed towards the scene. Ingrid Bailey, a wilderness firefighter and paramedic from Felton, California, and her friend Brad Westervelt were already on the boardwalk ahead of him. They had heard the cries of "Help! Bear!" and "Get a gun!" and so were headed towards the parking lot along with the other panicked people. Bailey, along with Westervelt and Headingham, were accustomed to encountering bears and so didn't let fear stop them as they grabbed sticks and chunks of wood and headed towards the scene. As they arrived at the viewing platform, they would see 2 bloodied bodies lying on the deck. Below them, the bear had Kitchen in its grip, with its jaws locked around his arm and shoulder and its claws tearing into his flesh. Bailey then hurled chunks of wood at the bear, screaming for it to release Kitchen, but her efforts too were in vain. Headingham and Westervelt would see a thick tree trunk nearby and attempt to use it as a battering ram, but even their combined efforts couldn't drive the persistent bear away. Bailey realized that they needed a gun and would then begin wondering where the park ranger was. Westervelt would decide to go find the ranger while Headingham, though exhausted and with a history of heart attacks, which of course didn't do him any favors given the stressful circumstances, would continue to fight the bear. It's at this point that suddenly, the bear would shift its position and begin attacking Kitchen once again and land its final blow, tossing him into the air violently, killing him instantly. As this was happening, Bailey tended to McConnell, checking for a pulse and attempting to resuscitate her despite knowing she was likely not coming back. Meanwhile, Headingham went to Kelly, who had just regained consciousness and was still trying to reach his mother. As they were tending to Kelly, the massive black bear would then once again appear on the deck near them. An enraged Headingham then kicks the bear with his hiking boots, causing it to stumble back. However, instead of fleeing, the animal moved towards the boardwalk, where other people were still present. Kelly then begged Headingham to help his mother, to which Headingham replied to him not to move and to breathe slowly, assuring him that they were doing everything that they could. Headingham, who had knowledge of first aid, used his handkerchief from his jacket to clean up the worst of Kelly's wounds. Just as Bailey realized that they needed towels to act as compresses and more helping hands to assist with CPR, a group of several men would rush up the stairs just in the nick of time, with one having a towel as well as knowledge of CPR. Headingham and the man with the towel would then help to bind Kelly's wounds, while another man assisted Bailey in compressing McConnell's chest as she attempted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. By this time, the bear had already left, but Bailey still couldn't help but wonder where the ranger was. Headingham then exclaimed that they needed to get the victims to the hospital, which is when he would leave to get some help. A man named Vandervelden, who was a research assistant from the University of Calgary, had been soaking in the upper pool. He'd rushed down to the boardwalk with some other bathers to see what was happening upon being alerted by all the commotion. It was at this point that someone shouts, "A bear's coming! Run for your lives!" As everyone fled, Vandervelden slipped and tumbled into the bushes, where the bear pounced on him and began to viciously maul him. Despite kicking and pulling at the animal's nose and ears, the bear would just not relent, and Vandervelde felt excruciating pain as its claws and teeth tore into his flesh, leaving deep wounds. Headingham finally arrives at the park ranger's office, where he'd recount the situation to Ranger Dave Webb, who quickly retrieved 2 rifles, a Winchester 30-30 and a Remington 223 from his motorhome. Accompanied by a young man named Dwayne Eggbroten, who he'd asked if he knew how to use a gun, the trio then rushed to the scene. Eggbroten arrived first and heard moans from below the boardwalk where the bear had dragged Vandervelden and was now feeding on him. Taking aim at the back of the bear's neck, Eggbroten would fire a perfect shot, causing the bear to collapse, and although he knew that the shot was fatal, he regardless of this fired 2 more shots to ensure its demise. Back on the viewing platform, Bailey was still attending to McConnell and her son when she'd heard the shots. Her pent-up tension and anger finally released as she cried out, "Shoot it again." It was at this point that the tragedy at Liard River Hot Springs had finally come to an end. Although Patty McConnell died that afternoon, Kelly McConnell and Ari Vandervelden would survive thanks to the heroic acts of Ray Kitchen, Ingrid Bailey, Frank Hedingham, and the others. They were flown to a hospital and would eventually recover from their severe injuries. More than 500 mourners attended the honoring of Ray Kitchen's bravery in Fort Nelson on August 22, 1997. In a letter to Kitchen's wife, U.S. President Bill Clinton wrote, "The heroism and selflessness that your husband displayed coming to the aid of Patty and Kelly McConnell is an example of all that is noble and good in human nature." Ray Kitchen would posthumously receive the Star of Courage from Canada in September of 1998, and Frank Hedingham, Kelly McConnell, Ingrid Bailey, and Brad Westervelt were also awarded decorations for their display of bravery. They, sloth bears, have a reputation for attacking people without apparent reason, provided that the person happens to pass too close, either while the bear is asleep, or feeding, or just ambling along. So the natives give the bears a wide berth. Together with the elephant, they command the greatest respect from jungle-dwelling folk. In the early hours of Sunday, June 5, 2022, an unsuspecting couple in India found themselves journeying through a dense forest on their way home from the temple one morning. However, little did Mukesh Rai and his wife Gudia know that a chance encounter with a sloth bear lay ahead. Deciding to confront the wild creature instead of retreating, the couple would on this fateful day realize the grave consequences of their choice. Sloth bears, despite their reputation as dangerous animals in India, are actually relatively small in size compared to other bear species. Adult sloth bears typically weigh around 80 to 145 kilograms, which is much lighter than the average weight of other bear species like grizzlies or polar bears. However, their smaller size may explain their highly aggressive nature, as well as why they've developed such responses to potential threats in their habitats survive in the wild, where they face constant danger from larger predators. According to the aforementioned Kenneth Anderson, author of Man-Eaters and Jungle Killers, it may come as a surprise that sloth bears cause more human deaths than even their larger, much more popular cousins, polar and grizzly bears. This observation was made in a study conducted in the year 2000 on sloth bear attacks in Madhya Pradesh between 1989 and 1994. The study revealed that over the course of 6 years, sloth bears caused 48 human fatalities and 687 maulings, averaging 123 attacks per year. This rate is 16 times higher than the comparative bear attack statistics of the entire state of Alaska during the same period. These results would lead many experts to conclude that sloth bears seem to pose a much more significant danger to human safety compared to any bear species in North America. Not to mention, the research also considered differences in population numbers, as well as the fact that varying levels of human contact significantly influence these statistics. After paying a routine early morning visit to the Kermai Temple in the early hours of Sunday, June 5, 2022, happily married couple Mukesh and Gudia Rai had been making their way back home on foot, and would on this day decide to cut through a wooded area near the temple to save them some time on the trip. A spontaneous decision that would in hindsight prove fatal. The couple would make it to about a kilometer away from home before suddenly crossing paths with a fully grown adult sloth bear, stopping them in their tracks. Thomas Sharp and the Wildlife SOS team argue that a main concern is that locals that live in proximity to sloth bears have a limited understanding of how to act around them, and highlighted that there's to this day no clear advice on the safest way to handle an encounter with one if unarmed, or even what to do if one does start charging you. In fact, in a 2017 study on sloth bear attack behavior and safety measures, Sharp interviewed people involved in 181 separate sloth bear encounters, and the findings made it hard to identify a one-size-fits-all approach for dealing with them, as each situation was unique. However, by examining the 3 most common responses from interviewees, they noted that some general strategies could be inferred. The first most common response was fighting back, which led to fatalities in 9% of these cases, with severe and minor injuries occurring in 12% and 50% of the instances, respectively. And the second most common response was running away. Among those people who attempted to escape, 11% were ultimately attacked and killed, while 9% sustained severe injuries and 42% had suffered moderate injuries. And then there's playing dead, which was the third most common response, in which no fatalities were reported among the individuals who did this during an attack. But 18% of these people would experience severe injuries, and 65% of them moderate ones. Understanding that attempting to flee was not a prudent decision, the couple chose to try to deter the bear by facing it assertively. And it was during this confrontation that the powerful sloth bear reportedly reacted aggressively, leading to a violent attack where the bear would go on to inflict fatal damage to their bodies. In an unforeseen encounter with a sloth bear, a person might confront a series of worrisome behaviors that escalate the danger. Visualize this: perceiving a threat or feeling trapped, the sloth bear opts to charge at the individual, seeking to intimidate or launch an attack. The atmosphere becomes tense as the sloth bear, possessing powerful forelimbs and elongated curved claws, powerfully strikes at the person, inflicting deep gashes and lacerations into their torso, and employs its formidable jaws and razor-sharp teeth to inflict nasty bites on their victims. And to further assert their dominance, the sloth bear leverages its substantial weight and strength to bring the victim to the ground, hindering their ability to escape or even protect themselves. This is the kind of unfolding of events which underscores the potential hazards as well as the intensity one may face during an encounter with the sloth bear. After neutralizing both Mukesh and Gudia, the mighty sloth bear would then drag both their bodies to a nearby river, where it would then begin feeding on their bodies. It wasn't until about 5 hours after the tragic incident that local authorities would arrive at the scene, where a large crowd had assembled due to the fast-spreading news of a fatal bear attack. Officials would need an additional 2 hours to sedate and apprehend the bear, and several reputable Indian media outlets would then disclose that the bear was to be relocated to a zoo in another city. Despite their efforts to conserve the bear's life, a later report would reveal that the bear had died about 2 hours after it was captured, information which was confirmed by Divisional Forest Officer Gaurav Sharma. A medical examination would be conducted which would reveal that the bear was rabid, and this likely contributed to not just its willingness to attack Mukesh and Gudia, but was likely the reason for its lack of responsiveness to gunshots that were fired in the air by locals that attempted to scare it away from the couple's bodies near the riverbank. In response to the tragic incident, the couple's dependents would be provided with financial aid amounting to about $5,000, although the reality was of course that no amount of money could possibly heal their pain. The tragic encounter between Mukesh and Gudia Ryan the sloth bear is a stark reminder that humans must always treat the wild with respect. As we navigate shared spaces with wildlife, understanding their behavior and habitats is crucial. Coexistence is key, especially in rural regions of a country as populous as India, where human and sloth bear encounters are an inevitability. Mukesh and Gudia's story remains a potent lesson in vigilance and a call for us to acknowledge and respect the power of nature. On a fateful day in April of 2008, the animal training world was met with devastating news when Stephen Miller, an esteemed Hollywood bear trainer and beloved colleague, was unexpectedly attacked by a bear while prepping for an upcoming film shoot. This is the horrific true story of Stephen Miller's fatal encounter with Rocky, the world's most famous grizzly bear. Located near San Diego, California, the Hollywood-famous Predators in Action has for a long time now been the place to go for filmmakers looking to feature exotic wildlife in their movies.
I've been raising exotic animals for over 25 years. I've done some of the biggest animal scenes ever done.
Owned by the late Stephen and his cousin Randy Miller, this world-renowned animal training facility has for many years now been highly regarded for its spectacular displays of trained exotic predators. A list that includes tigers, lions, leopards, and of course, grizzly bears. These formidable yet undoubtedly magnificent creatures are nurtured and trained here from infancy to perform some of the most incredible and never-before-seen stunts on film, captivating audiences across the world with unique displays of obedience, and specializing in staged attacks, the Millers and the various animals they worked with had a reputation of being a versatile as well as an incredibly efficient team. Not to mention, Predators in Action featured some of the best animal trainers in the country. And judging by the accounts of many filmmakers in Hollywood, there was almost no act that the Millers couldn't train even the most feared animals on the planet to perform. Backboned by Randy's expertise, the Predators in Action team as well as the facility was furthermore considered the industry standard in terms of efficient safety measures when training wild exotic animals, many of which they themselves were pioneers of, and would often be borrowed or inspired by many others in the field.
I've built my business on action, staged attacks, creating an out-of-control look, but with control around the set, dangerous-looking animals, snarling, attacking.
Considering the sheer might of the animals that they were dealing with, getting them to follow orders from a creature they could easily tear apart at will was of course a much more dangerous task than, let's say, training a puppy would be, to put it lightly. They would specialize in staging some of the most realistic controlled scenes ever caught on camera of dangerous animal and human encounters. Although everyone that worked at the facility were undoubtedly animal lovers, it was also well known that nobody enjoyed working with the animals more than Steven did. Business for the facility would boom for years to come. At its peak, one contract after another would fall into their laps from some of the most notable names in Hollywood, and the most unexpected of stars would soon arise from amongst the animals. One that would not just capture the hearts of millions across the globe with his teddy bear-like demeanor, but would also go on to be a spectacle that they would regard as something nobody thought they'd ever see on camera. According to Randy, Rocky was no ordinary bear.
Stevie was, great with animals. He loved the grizzly bear. We had a grizzly bear, Dakota. Stevie spent every day with him, bottle feeding, from infancy, raising him like his own child.
The grizzly had been with the training center since he was a cub, and had practically never shown any signs of aggression. As time went on, Rocky would rise to stardom in rapid fashion, the peak of which would include a role in the 2008 parody film Semi-Pro as Dewey the Killer Bear, where he'd grapple with Randy Miller as Will Ferrell's body double, a remarkable achievement for any show animal, let alone a grizzly. In the days leading up to the attack, Steven requested Randy that he be the one to be filmed wrestling Rocky for an upcoming advertisement. Steven was a well-respected trainer himself.
And this bear is real friendly, likes people, loves to play. Was just getting ready to, wrestle the bear.
Like Randy, Steven was nevertheless confident that he could handle him and adapt quickly, given his plethora of experience. He would also mention to his cousin that the two had grown familiar with each other at least a little bit, given the slight interaction they'd had in a previous photo shoot. Randy begins visualizing the scenario and thus gets incredibly excited about the on-screen potential of Steven and Rocky, confident that Steven wouldn't have trouble handling Rocky given his typical gentle demeanor and playful nature. And so, Randy goes with his gut and thus decides to let Steven be the one to be in the shot. After which, they would begin rehearsing a controlled, playful wrestling match, which is pretty much exactly what Rocky and Randy had done on the set of Semi-Pro, less than just 2 months prior. It's April 22nd, 2008, and a promo shoot for ShareNow.com is about to commence. Steven and Rocky are almost ready for their big moment. The photographers were positioned to capture the initial shots, where Steven and Rocky were framed standing upright next to each other. And it's precisely at this moment that things take an unexpected turn for the worse, as Rocky suddenly turns his head and enters his wrestling stance ahead of his cue. A startled Steven would have no time to prepare for what came next. The 7.5-foot, 700-pound grizzly bites and latches onto Steven's neck, knocking him to the ground and pinning him from above. Randy then runs into the frame from the side and begins striking Rocky with a cane as hard as he could in an attempt to make him release his cousin. Unfortunately, this action only seemed to aggravate Rocky, who then proceeds to thrash Steven from side to side like a ragdoll, with his neck still trapped between his jaws. The crew then used bear spray and finally managed to get Rocky to release Steven, at which point Steven stumbles away from the bear and off camera, where he then just a few seconds later collapses. Despite valiant efforts by medics which were on standby, it would later be revealed that Steven's jugular vein and carotid artery had been brutally severed, and he would inevitably succumb to his injuries within just minutes of the tragic ordeal.
We worked on him the whole time. We prayed that, he wouldn't die, because he was my brother.
In the wake of Steven's death, California's Department of Fish and Game would launch an investigation to determine Rocky's ultimate fate. Many advocates for animal rights came forward in solidarity with PETA, demanding that instead of euthanasia, that he be granted his freedom by being retired in a zoo or similar environment. And the argument was simple for them, as they stated that a grizzly bear is not an actor, and thus cannot be held accountable for doing what comes naturally to it. As a response to this demand, an episode of Grizzly Face to Face, which had aired sometime after the attack on the National Geographic Channel, would reveal that the eventual decision to keep Rocky alive was something highly unconventional, and would elaborate that they believed euthanization, something that would typically be the go-to measure in light of such occurrences, was in order. But despite such public appeals, Rocky's life would inevitably be spared, although regulations around containing him were firm. He was to be housed in isolation from visitors and adhere strictly to trainer-only interaction protocols. This would also mean that Rocky the Bear had thereby been prohibited from appearing in movies or television, putting an end to what looked like a rise to fame like no other. And it was in this very same episode of Grizzly's Face to Face where Randy Miller controversially expressed his intent to honor what he believes Steven would have done, given Rocky's restrictions, which he believed would have very likely been to fight for Rocky, to have his rights granted back to him, as well as the leniency he was accustomed to around humans since he was a cub. And he would also go on to elaborate that Steven would want Rocky to resume his movie career and reclaim his throne as the grisliest star in Hollywood. On what was a normal stroll through its habitat in the winter of 1985 at the Chattahoochee National Forest, a curious American black bear stumbled upon something peculiar lying on the forest ground. The bear would approach this item with fascination and began to paw and slash at it until it finally tore open, which is when suddenly a strong chemical odor would fill the air. And less than 10 minutes later, this bear would go on to experience something that no other creature on Earth has likely ever experienced before. This incredible and quite frankly unbelievable story has captured the world's attention, and it probably comes as no surprise that very recently, a popular major motion picture based on it has been making headlines across the world. Movies, however, are movies after all, and when Hollywood bases one on a real-life story, there are usually many differences between what's seen on film and what actually occurred in real life. Which is why the following video will depict in detail the actual true story of the legendary Cocaine Bear. In the early weeks of December 1985, a hunter was cautiously trekking through the woods of the Chattahoochee National Forest in northern Georgia. His objective was to stalk and hunt a deer, which he'd been tracking for over a mile. However, as he continued to stealthily move forward, the absence of any signs of the deer made him doubt the success of his mission. But despite these frustrations of his, he nevertheless would continue to progress with the hunt, which is when he would just moments later notice a clearing up ahead. But to his shock and surprise, it wasn't a deer he saw in the clearing. Instead, it was a colossal American black bear. Though black bears are typically shy, the hunter knew that startling one could result in a potentially lethal attack. Equipped with this knowledge, he would then quickly hide behind a rock, gripping his rifle tightly as he began scheming his escape plan. His initial thought was to quietly retreat without the bear noticing him. But then the hunter would recall just how noisy the dried leaves he'd been stepping on were, as they made loud crunching noises under his feet while he traversed the wood. And he was concerned that his footsteps could alert the bear to his presence if he tried to walk out of the predicament unassumingly. At this point, he briefly considered standing up and shooting at the bear with his deer hunting rifle, but he knew it wasn't powerful enough to take down a black bear on time, if at all. Moreover, he knew that he was at risk of being attacked and mauled by the bear before he could even get a chance to subdue it. As he pondered his next move, he noticed something peculiar. He hadn't heard the bear for quite some time. And typically, of course, bears are noisy animals whose breathing alone can be heard from a distance. As moments went by, the hunter would grow more and more suspicious of the silence, which is when he stood up and, as quietly as possible, peers out from the rock he was hiding behind into the clearing. To his relief, he saw that the bear's body had been laying lifeless on the ground, and it was slumped forward in an awkward position. The hunter was so relieved by this sight that he almost burst into laughter, which is when, without hesitation of course, he emerges from his hiding spot and makes his way through the brush to get a better view of the bear. As the hunter stood over the young bear, he couldn't help but notice that something was off. The bear was obviously way too young to have died of natural causes, yet he couldn't see any visible injuries, nor did it look malnourished. It literally seemed to him as if this bear had simply dropped dead for no apparent reason. However, the hunter didn't dwell on this for long, and instead tried to in his mind piece together the most logical explanation for the bear's death. Little did he know that the real reason for its demise was far from logical. To uncover the truth of what happened, we have to go back to September 10th of 1985, when two pilots were flying their Cessna over northern Georgia. They would intercept a radio message intended for other pilots, discussing how their plane was going to be followed. Knowing the risks of getting caught, the main pilot of the Cessna instructed his co-pilot they would have to jump out of the plane. He then set the plane to fly on autopilot until it ran out of fuel or crashed. He then motioned for the co-pilot to follow him into the main cabin where their luggage was stored. The co-pilot, in a state of confusion and panic, complied, and as the men climbed over the front seats, they then began strapping parachutes onto their luggage while the main pilot instructed the co-pilot to open the side door of the plane. With the door open, a rush of cold night air and howling wind would fill the cabin, making it difficult for the pilots to communicate. The main pilot then proceeded to push the luggage out of the plane, with the co-pilot joining in. Once all the luggage was out, the main pilot handed a parachute to the co-pilot and gestured for him to put it on. As the co-pilot struggled to put on the parachute, the main pilot donned his own and suddenly pushed the co-pilot out of the plane. The main pilot would then jump out after him, leaving the plane on autopilot to eventually crash in a suburb of Knoxville, Tennessee, about 5 hours later. Meanwhile, an 85-year-old man named Fred Myers, who suffered from Alzheimer's disease, woke up before sunrise as part of his daily routine. Fred's routine was key in helping him manage his Alzheimer's symptoms, especially in the morning when he would feel much more dazed than at any other time in the day. And dawn was also the time where he would sort of go on his own kind of autopilot, if you will. However, this morning was much different than his usual ones when he noticed something strange in his driveway. As he went in to investigate, he saw the main pilot of the Cessna crash land on his driveway after his main parachute would fail to deploy fully, causing fatal injuries. A stunned Fred would then gather himself and make sure he wasn't imagining things due to his condition before calling the police, who quickly heeded his call and would shortly into an intensive search find a dead man dressed in a bulletproof vest, camouflage fatigues, and night vision goggles. But strangely enough, he was wearing Gucci loafers, which would make the police instantly doubt that he was military. And to find out the identity of this mystery man, I'm going to take you back to 2 weeks prior to the hunter's discovery of the bear in Chattahoochee National Forest. At this time, the black bear was living its typical bear life, foraging for food and wandering the forest. And on one such day, the bear spotted a strange object lying on the ground, which turned out to be one of the duffel bags pushed out of the plane by the pilots. Despite not knowing what was inside, the bear approached it with optimism and began clawing at this heavy bag. Its mighty claws would easily tear open a hole in the duffel bag, and immediately a strong flowery scent would fill the air around it. The bear then eagerly stuck its nose into the rip and began licking and sniffing the contents inside of this bag. It devoured everything inside. Little can this bear comprehend that it had just ingested 70 pounds of pure cocaine. The bear would then shortly after feel a surge of adrenaline so powerful it caused it to begin sprinting in a straight line at top speed. After running at this speed for about 100 yards, every major system in the bear's body would abruptly shut down, at which point it would collapse on the spot and perish. 2 weeks later, the aforementioned hunter stumbled upon the dead bear in Chattahoochee National Forest, and upon returning home he informed a friend about the discovery and also mentioned in passing that he'd seen a duffel bag in close proximity to the bear. At this point in time, the police had gathered information about the deceased man found in Fred Meyer's driveway, who was identified as Andrew Thornton, the main pilot of the Cessna. Thornton was a 40-year-old former U.S. Army paratrooper who turned to the high-risk, high-reward trade of smuggling illegal goods as a means to support himself. The police also learned that Thornton, along with a co-pilot, had been flying the crashed Cessna found in the mountains of North Carolina. The co-pilot of the plane, who survived the jump, confirmed that Thornton was the main pilot and that they had pushed the luggage out of the plane over northern Georgia on his command before the crash. Most of the missing bags were eventually found, but some were still unaccounted for. When the hunter's friend heard about the duffel bag in the Chattahoochee National Forest, they thought it might be one of those missing bags and contacted the authorities, which is when the bag was later found near the dead bear, empty of its contents of course, due to the bear already having consumed every bit of it. And the reason why all the bags, including the one found by the hunter's friend, were filled with cocaine was because Thornton was of course a drug smuggler. On the night that he and his co-pilot jumped out of the Cessna, they were transporting 900 pounds of cocaine from South America to the US. And once again, if it weren't for the transmission that they'd heard on their radio from federal agents who'd been alerted to their drug run, they would likely have been successful in their missions. The authorities who had found the empty duffel bag in the Chattahoochee National Forest were unsure of where the cocaine had gone. However, they would decide to bring back the dead black bear's body and perform an autopsy on it based on a hunch, which is when the medical examiner discovered that the bear's stomach was filled to the brim with cocaine, confirming that it likely died from a massive overdose. However, the bear's story does not end here. Normally, after an animal is autopsied, it's thereafter cremated, but for some reason, the medical examiner decided to have the bear taxidermied instead. The taxidermied bear was then gifted to the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area, and over the next 2 decades, the ownership of the bear would change hands several times, and it's unclear why, or even by whom. And reports furthermore indicate that it was also stolen once from a storage facility and sold at a pawn shop, and was even owned by country singer Waylon Jennings at some point. And although this story has become quite famous, there are still some lesser known facts about the infamous cocaine bear that I thought I'd add to this video that are in my opinion definitely worth knowing. The bear's real name was actually Pablo Escobar, in reference to the infamous Colombian drug lord, of course, Pablo Escobar. And in case you don't know, Pablo was well known for smuggling large quantities of cocaine. And large quantities, of course, is in fact an understatement when it comes to Pablo. When it comes to the psychological effects that the ingestion of that much cocaine would have on a bear, based on the available information, it's difficult to determine exactly what they were. However, experts have made some educated guesses based on how cocaine affects the human brain. Cocaine is a stimulant drug that can cause increased energy, alertness, and euphoria in humans. It also in turn can lead to increased heart rate, blood pressure, and abnormal body temperature, as well as reduced appetite and sleep. Over time, of course, repeated use of cocaine can lead to severe addiction and a range of negative physical and mental health effects, including anxiety, depression, paranoia, and psychosis. And given the bear consumed a large amount of the substance, it's very likely that it experienced at least some of these effects, especially immediately after initial consumption, when it, as previously mentioned, experienced a rush, which once again caused it to sprint in a straight line at top speed. Investigators furthermore indicated that the amount of cocaine that the bear ingested would likely have caused it to become hyperactive, aggressive, and definitely anxious, and it likely also suppressed its appetite and disrupted its sleep, causing further confusion to an animal that is famous for eating and sleeping aplenty. In the end, however, we don't know for sure how the cocaine specifically affected the bear's behavior or even its health, as there have been no scientific studies conducted on this topic to draw conclusions from. The following story is known as one of the most shocking and not to mention devastating bear attacks in North American history. This terrifying attack took place in Wow Mountain, Colorado. Located in San Isabel National Forest, this is a summit decorated with steep, jagged mountains, bathed for the most part with pine and fir trees. Near its pockets of water, the beautiful mountain landscape furthermore boasts aspen and berry bushes,
as well as pockets of willow. It is also home to a variety of North American wildlife, ranging from herbivores such as deer and elk to an unknown number of black bears. There are many people whose careers involve outdoor living, and a perfect example of one such person would be none other than Colin McClelland, a lumberjack who followed in his father's footsteps and carried on the family legacy of harvesting timber from timber stands. After several years of working in Wild Mountain, Colin reported a number of incidents involving bears. This included one occurrence in which a bear had managed to break into his camper and devour all his food supply. Bears are omnivores and are just as opportunistic as they are capable hunters. 90% of a black bear's diet consists of vegetable matter such as berries, nuts, and acorns. In terms of meat, bears in majority eat insects and carrion, but will not shy away from making a quick meal out of small rodents such as mice, and when the opportunity presents itself, garbage left behind by humans. There are also instances, of course, where bears, and black bears in particular, have engaged humans in purely predatory fashion, with no other intentions but consumption. On other occasions, Colin would see bears show up around his RV during the nighttime, blatantly scratching and sniffing around for food in his campsite. Despite having the foresight to ensure the outside of his camper would be free of any potential bear attractants, it later became clear to him that it was his very own food supply which he had stored in his camper, which was attracting the bears via their powerful sense of smell. Unbeknownst to Colin at the time, 4 nuisance black bears were ear-tagged and sedated in Wild Mountain since 1988. With the bears frequenting his camp more often, their temperaments also began to show noticeable changes. The bears would sniff around for food at night, showing lesser and lesser fear as each night passed. It seemed that the bears had now seen Colin as a normal part of their environment, which meant that they no longer needed to be cautious or fearful of his presence. On Friday the 13th of August 1993, Colin had been in his RV recovering from a strong flu which he had contracted while harvesting lodgepole pines, a task which takes an even harsher toll on one's immune system, especially if they're sick. To top things off, Colin had also been sleeping on his RV's roof for the past several nights, as he was afraid of the bears, who had once again lost all fear that they had of him. As he prepared dinner on his stove that night, Colin began weighing out the options: to spend the night on the roof of his RV in the cold while still recovering from the flu, or take his chances and sleep in the camper, as no bears had broken into the RV on the previous nights when he had been sleeping on the roof. As Colin sat there thinking, he remembered that a friend had recently lent him a high-caliber rifle capable of taking down bears. Colin then felt a sense of security engulf his emotions, which, coupled with his fatigued and sick body, made him ultimately decide to succumb to the comforts of his RV. He takes some flu medicine, lays on his bed, turns off the lights, and begins drifting into a deep slumber. As the night breeze carried the scent of the dinner he had cooked through the valley, it finally found itself entering the nostrils of bears in the vicinity. It's important to note that bears spend most of their summers putting on weight in preparation for a long winter of hibernation. This particular bear, however, was just a 240-pound black bear who had little luck bulking up for the winter, leaving him weak to fight for dominance over other stronger, more well-nourished males. And of course, this made the bear too hungry and opportunistic to avoid an easy meal. It was this very bear that was allured by the aroma seeping out of Colin's RV. The bear curiously approaches the RV, looking for gaps or air pockets where the scent of food was the strongest, and his eyes quickly lock on to the crack underneath the RV's door. Now, don't get it twisted. Although black bears are commonly known to shy away from humans, when a black bear does attack, this is usually a predatory attack. In other words, that bear wants to make a meal out of you. Other than instances where they are protecting their cubs, if a black bear attacks you, the best thing to do is to fight back. Because playing dead as one would with a grizzly bear, in most cases will not work if one were ever to be unfortunate enough to be a victim of an attacking black bear. The bear begins prying at the door with its claws, desperately attempting to remove the barrier between it and the food that it's been smelling. Colin jolts up from his bed, instantly recognizing the danger of the circumstances. And as the door began to bend and break, Colin quickly grabs the rifle that his friend lent him and fired a shot through the door, hoping to make contact with the bear. But the prying would not stop, and in turn began to get even more aggressive. The lock on the door finally submits to the bear's might, and the RV door flies open. And despite the food that it was smelling this whole time just being meters away, the bear avoided it completely, and instead went straight for Colin, who was standing frozen in shock near his bed. The bear charges at Colin, clawing and biting at him in the moment of impact. His fight or flight response kicks in, allowing him to muster up what little energy his sick body could spew out, to at least allow him a chance to process a way out of the situation, if not fight his way out of it. Colin hurls punches at the bear in desperation with his fatigued arms, to no effect. The beast then knocks him to the ground. And as Colin eked out some final attempts at saving his own life, it was clear that he stood no chance against the bear, who then went for the death blow, clapping its mouth around Colin's head, which crushed his skull instantly, ending his life in immediate fashion, at which point the bear began to calmly consume his lifeless body. Friends who had known Colin had been battling illness showed up at the RV to pay him a visit shortly after the attack. They wanted to see if he felt any better, but upon arriving, to their shock and horror, all they saw were his bloodied remains spread out about 30 yards from the entrance of his RV. His body was almost eaten to the bone. Authorities later said that the attack could very well have been predatory, but it could also have been the bear's way of asserting its dominance over Colin. Investigators later also revealed that the bear most likely consumed Colin's body in 3 intervals. First, it partially consumed the body in the RV immediately after the attack, after which it returned twice in the following days to finish the job. Wildlife management officers later set up a catch trap near Colin's trailer and shortly thereafter managed to capture and kill the bear that claimed the young logger's life. The 240-pound animal was identified by a bullet wound that it had on its side, matching the size of the bullet hole that Colin had shot into the RV's door. But the story doesn't end here. To further ensure that they caught the right bear, the animal was blood tested for a specific protein which is present only after the consumption of human flesh. And to their surprise, there was no such protein present in this bear's digestive system. Authorities later returned to the site for an even further investigation, and it was later discovered that the bear tracks for the bear who had killed Colin were in fact from a smaller bear. And after performing a necropsy on the animal that they had killed, they confirmed that the bear that they had killed was in fact not a small malnourished bear like the one that had eaten Colin, but this was a much stronger and healthier bear who had just happened to be mistaken for the original culprit.
If this video piqued your interest, then Volume 1 of Life-Ending Bear Attacks is sure to do the same. You can find that compilation on the end screen of this video.